So,
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation of An Evening with Mamta Chaudhry and Russell Banks. We're presenting this evening tonight in collaboration with three of our favorite organizations to work with: the Miami Book Fair, of course, Lit Hub, and Culture Crusaders. And tonight we're celebrating the paperback release of Mamta's debut novel, Haunting Paris. Last year we had a wonderful event at the bookstore, a physical event for the hardcover release of this book, with hundreds of people packed to the rafters. And now, because of everything that's gone on, we're going virtual. But believe it or not, and I'm sure you all believe it, we have the same hundreds of people joining us from everywhere on this broadcast. And I want to thank you all for being with us. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mitchell Kaplan of Books and Books as well. Haunting Paris, Mamta's book, has been praised as elegantly wrought by the New York Times and a heart-wrenching love letter to Paris by Publishers Weekly. Mamta lives in Coral Gables, not far from the bookstore, and she and her husband Daniel spend part of each year in France. Her novel is set in Paris in 1989, when the main character Sylvie discovers a mysterious letter among her late lover Julian's possessions, launching her into a decades-old search for a child who vanished in World War II. Sylvie is unaware that she is watched over by Julian's ghost, and her quest leads her deep into the secrets of his past, shedding light on the dark days of Nazi-occupied Paris. Mamta tonight, as I mentioned, will be in conversation with a member of our family, a member of the Books and Books family, just as Mamta is, the wonderful, great writer Russell Banks. Russell's been twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he's, I would say, one of the most prestigious fiction writers that we have writing today. He's a past president of the International Parliament of Writers and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His work has been translated into 20 languages, and he has received numerous prizes and awards, including the Commonwealth Award for Literature. But on a personal note, we at Books and Books, it's now almost 40 years that we've been in business. And I can remember back to the early days when I was a young bookseller. And the very, very, very first book that I became completely enamored with and put in every single person's hand was a book called Continental Drift that Russell wrote so many years ago. And in fact, what happened because of that, Russell and I became friends after we invited him down to be part of something that was a little bit of Coral Gables history that many people don't know about. It was called the Coral Gables Festival of Books and Writers back in the early 1980s. So it was like 1983. I'm sorry, Russell, for dating you that way. So Russell and Mamta are very dear and close to all of us at Books and Books. And tonight, they will be sitting down to chat about Mamta's wonderful Haunting Paris and the dark days of Nazi occupation during World War II. That occupation continues to haunt the City of Light. They'll also be taking questions from all of you, so have them ready. So I want to thank you again for coming. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Mamta and Russell. Thank you.
thank you, Mitchell. Thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight for this event. I couldn't be happier to be in this virtual company. I have to tell you, when I'm doing a live event, I'm always nervous that I'm suddenly going to freeze up. And when we do a virtual event, I'm doubly nervous because then I think the video is going to freeze up too. But I'm really grateful to all the independent booksellers who keep writers and readers connected through this time when most of us are still staying home. And my bookstore, of course, my local indie bookstore is Books and Books, owned by Mitchell Kaplan, who was one of the founders of the Miami Book Fair. And he has just transformed and enriched the literary landscape for all of us. And with all the protests going on, I want to tell you about another Miami icon who transformed and enriched the cultural and musical landscape here. In the 1950s, Ruth Greenfield started the first integrated music conservatory. Her neighbors on exclusive Palm Island made it quite clear that little Black children coming to Ruth's house to study music were not welcome. But Ruth didn't close down the conservatory. Instead, she and her husband moved close to the historic Black neighborhood of Overtown. And Ruth is a dazzling pianist herself. She studied in Paris with Nadia Boulanger. When my husband and I went to Paris for the first time, we were just so lucky to have the Greenfields as guides. And so it's no surprise that many, many, many years later, when I wrote a novel about Paris, it should turn out to be a love letter to the city of light and to the music of Ruth Greenfield. Paris is one of those cities that it's very easy to love and very hard to know. You know, before I even went, a lot of American and French friends warned me that to cross the threshold, c'est difficile. But for me, it seemed more than difficile. It seemed impossible. I am so clearly an étrangère, a stranger, a foreigner, an outsider. You know, I have to tell you, I didn't start out to write about Paris, and certainly not from this perspective. I'm not French. I'm not Jewish, neither man nor ghost. But that's the voice I heard, and I was compelled to follow it wherever it took me. And what gave me a way in is that a ghost is the ultimate outsider. And I think Russell will agree when we are chatting later on that sometimes you don't get to choose your stories. Sometimes they choose you. One day, as I was walking down a street on Ile Saint Louis, I heard a drift of music coming down from a lighted window. And I had this really vivid impression of a man leaning forward, listening very intently. As you'll see, the man was Julien, drawn back by the music to the woman he loved and to a world in which he had unfinished business. So the novel is set in 1989, when all Paris is getting ready to celebrate the bicentennial of that seminal moment in French history, the French Revolution, which gave us the inspiring motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, which even now you can see carved into every public building and monument everywhere you go in France. But Sylvie, up in her apartment on Ile Saint Louis, is mourning the loss of Julien. And when she accidentally dislodges a letter from his desk, as Mitchell mentioned, she sets off on this quest, which takes her back to the year 1942, when France was under Nazi occupation. And it was a time the Jews were being rounded up, and France singularly failed to live up to its own glorious promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So this is a love story in which one of the lovers is dead, a mystery in which the detective is a pianist who is so shy that her nickname is Sylvie La Timide, a historical novel which has urgent resonances in our present, and a ghost story in which the ghost is the least terrifying thing of all. So I always get asked, do you believe in ghosts? No, of course I don't. And yet, you are always in their company in Paris. And they are particularly thick on the Ile Saint Louis. You know, I sense them crowding around me, and I want to look over my shoulder and say, who are you? What draws you back? But they retreat into the shadows and into silence. So many scenes in the novel take place in and around Notre Dame on Ile de la Cité, and the two islands in the Seine are at the heart of the Paris I thought I was writing about. City of light, city of art, city of music, city of love. And then many years after I had started going to Paris, Ruth Greenfield asked me, have you ever been to the deportation memorial? And I hadn't even heard of it. But the very next time I went looking for it, it was the first place I went to on that trip. And right behind Notre Dame, where its soaring towers reach for the sky, there is this little museum that sinks into the earth. And that's where I became aware of the long shadows of the past that still haunt the city of light. And there's a bronze circle on the floor, which is chiseled with the words, they went to the end of the earth and they did not return. And that's when my hair stood straight on end, because I remembered the French word for ghost is revenant, one who returns. So that became the first line in the book. And I also had the answer to my question, what draws you back? So I'll just briefly read the first page from the novel, which pulls together all these things that I've been talking about. And then we'll go to our discussion and then to your questions. They call us revenants, those who return. Restless for this world, we pass each other in mute recognition. For to be silent and solitary is our essential condition. But death doesn't end our thirst for a human touch, a human voice calling our name. And so I haunt these familiar caves, this familiar river. Music drifts down from Sylvie's window, and I linger until it comes to an end. The scent of lilacs on the breeze stirs dormant phantoms to life, but music is sorcery more potent. Though bound to time's measure, it exists on a plane beyond time, where there is no past and no future. There is only the present, in which the dead revisit this world. Night after night, I wait until the last notes fade away, and Sylvie comes to the window at last. I retreat into the shadows as one after another, the beautiful mansions along Quai d'Anjou spring to light, transforming those in the gloom below into a throng of ghosts. Occasionally, a passing figure pauses in a pool of lamplight to light a cigarette or glance at a watch. Squandered time, the most enduring of regrets. In the end, a lifetime is not enough. The heart yearns for more. Who can reason with desire? The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know. So that's the first page. And after talking so much about the book, I feel like Richard Wagner after he was going on and on about his operas once, he said, "But enough about me." And he turned to his listener and he said, "What do you think of my music?" So, Russell, I want you to come on and say what you think about Paris and about this period in its history.
Oh no, more than that. Let me speak about your music, if I may. Uh, it's the book is a beautiful book, and I love it for many reasons. For its formal, careful, imaginative structure, um, which really kind of amazed me once I started thinking about it and thinking about how difficult it must have been to arrange these parts and these characters and these timelines together in a way that would make a smooth and clear narrative, which you have done. Of course, the characters themselves, which are lasting. I mean, I read the book in galleys a year and a half, 2 years ago almost, and it still is in my mind. The characters are still very vividly present. Uh, all of them, and not just Julian, the male character whose narrative you began with, the ghost, as it were, the presence from the other world, and Sylvie, who is the main. You describe her as a detective, but she's so much more than that, of course. But also the children of Julien's marriage, his wife, whom he left for Sylvie, and one of the most intriguing and engaging characters for me was Anna, the concierge. I love her. I especially love her. And I don't know how the hell you figured out or had the insight to know this. Her view of the Americans who come. Was it Tom and what's the name of the wife? I've forgotten her name.
Alice.
Alice.
Yeah.
Tom. Perfect
Yeah.
American names.
Will and Alice.
Yeah, they come and they rent an apartment in the same building, and the concierge's view of them is so authentically French and funny and smart and insightful. So the characters live with me. But two other things I just want to add, I guess, in talking about the book. The tone, there is an atmosphere that um, subsumes the entire text, of a mix of melancholy and loss and a determination to overcome that. And that's so rare. Books either opt for one or the other. Um, they don't try to merge the two, and novels don't. And yours does in a way which is remarkable, and I can speak further about it because of the structure of the disintegration of the family that by war and genocide in the 40s and 30s and 40s is at the center of it. But the disintegration of the family, not just society at large, is central. And then the rebuilding of family later, decades later. Through a kind of resilience and determination on the part of your two main characters in particular, is really wonderful and remarkable and optimistic, positive. So the combination of the two is in this book is really remarkable to me and unusual, valuable, and worthy of all the compliments you've been getting for this book. Then I guess the last thing I wanted to compliment you on and tell you that impressed me about the book was just simply the language, the flow of the language, the precision of the language. I was actually today, I pulled the book out and I started going back over it and looking at it, and saying, God, that's a good sentence. There's a real smart, clean sentence. And I just started feeling happy about the prose. And I thought, this is a writer who works. And it was very moving to me.
Well, thank you, Russell. I mean, when you talk about it made you happy, I'm ready to just weep with delight at what you're saying. You just so totally get the book. And when you're talking about the tone, I'm thinking about your own books, which deal with the past. But as Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. You write about Cloud Splitter. You write about your own involvement in the civil rights movement, and we're going through turbulent times here as well. But one of the things that really fascinated me when writing this book, everything you're saying about the language, the characters, I am going to listen to this tape when it's out like 300 times, so I memorize it by heart. And every time I'm feeling depressed, I'll just play the tape. But one of the things that we all ask, why didn't people do something? Were they blind? Were they afraid? Were they complicit? And that's something that I think about even for our time. Like, what would we do? And courage is such an important aspect of the book for me, that the one person who is just cripplingly shy is the only one who gets up and is the lone voice in the room to say something. And just recently, I was reading about a man called Rahul Dubey in Washington, D.C. When all the protesters were being dispersed by tear gas, he opened his door and he let 70 people, 70 strangers, into his apartment. And I'm thinking, well, we talk about courage. Why didn't people do something? Would we do that? Would I do that? Would I let in all these strangers, particularly in a time where everyone seems to be armed to the teeth? And I think it's this thing about the book is something that is particular to that time and place, but it's also universal. Even in India,
it's
there
very
is
much
so
that.
much.
Yeah, you make it very pointed. I think there were at least 3 times in there where, and it's through the character of the judge, who I really kind of liked, who's a pompous old bourgeois, a kind of figure, very French, very sure of himself, and very liberal in all the ways one hopes one is on oneself. And he's talking about his marriage primarily, and he says that he chose comfort over passion. And then it comes up again with Sylvie somewhere, where she chose, and also with Julian, who says that he chose passion over comfort. And that choice, that is sort of existential moment where you choose one over the other, is exactly what you're describing, talking about the moment today. We all have to face that moment where we choose passion over comfort. We faced it. I faced it in my youth in the 60s and 70s, and we're facing it again today. And it's most difficult for those of us who are comfortable, because we have to reject comfort in order to choose passion. And passion is unsettled and unpredictable. And of course, the results in their novel lead to a kind of catastrophe in some ways for the marriage, the Julian's marriage, and his role in the marriage as a father with his 2 children. And it dislodges everybody's life, and I like that word, dislodge. It moves them out of their lodging, in their emotional and filial lodgings, and forces them to reintegrate later. That part of the story, actually, I didn't get at first when I read it. Later, I began to realize what a family story it was, and how interesting it was about family in our time and the recombinant nature of our families. And how out of necessity and opportunity, we've all come to begin, well, I should say, we've begun to realize that families are a kind of creation and not an inheritance. And that's a fairly radical idea that is beginning to filter down, I think, to the rest of us.
And particularly now, when most of us are confined to our homes, isolated, we realize that we create our own community, we create our own family. The people that we reach out to most are the families that we have chosen in some way, whether they belong to us by blood or not, by birth or not. They are our family. And as Mitchell was saying, that you're a member of the Books and Books family, and I hope I am too. You're a permanent member of the family, to quote the title.
That's funny.
Yeah, which is, hey folks, if you haven't read it, you must read it. Nobody writes about families and about dogs the way Russell does. And I think
you did a good job with a dog. You have a little typical French dog named Coco, of course, in the story. And I just thought, oh God, she nailed that dog. I mean, there's a kind of French dog that an American would find really exotic and peculiar. But you made the dog actually a very friendly presence throughout the book. It's very funny about the dog. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop you.
No, this is, listen, he is as much a character as anyone else, and as much a character as the city of Paris is. And, you were talking about joining the stories together, and that was a real challenge for me. And just because I will confess this to everyone, I am a complicated, neurotic woman. I choose like the most difficult time possibilities that I can. And not only did I have this going with the two time periods, and of course, in the spectral calendar, Julien can travel back and forth even further than these two times. But I had a whole section that dealt with the Roman occupation of Paris. And my editor and publisher, Nantalise, just went, you have to get rid of that. And I thought, but that's years of research. That's a third of the book. And you know what? She was absolutely, completely right. So when you say about it being complex and woven together, well, if I had my way, I'd have driven myself and everyone else mad by making it even more complicated.
Oh, well, that's the value and the need, I suppose, we have for a good editor, a sympathetic and intelligent and experienced editor like Nantalise is, of course. She's a wonderful, marvelous woman, too. I wanted to ask you something. I was just thinking about the precedents for this novel, and I wondered if the Henry James Turn of the Screw had any effect on you, or if it was in any way in your mind, because it's one of the most literate and beautiful and lasting ghost stories that I know of in the English language, certainly. And it's also beautifully ambiguous in somewhat the same way yours is. And I wondered if that was something you had in the back of your mind when you were working on this novel.
Well, I'm going to say that I'm much more intelligent than I am. And so, yes, it was, but it wasn't actually. I see exactly why you're saying that, because of the whole family thing too. You know, how there's, where the danger is not.
Yes.
The two children. And that the danger is often within the house. It doesn't come from outside.
Right.
One of the things I discovered, even though I say this is a ghost story, it's more this presence that is there. And I've read a lot of books like Turn of the Screw, like Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. So many books where there is a ghostly presence. But what I discovered in writing this is that each ghost haunts in its own way. Every ghost has its own particular definite way of haunting. There isn't one great ectoplasmic ghostly thing that you can draw on. And for me, the part of the ghost, the thing that was chilling was not the ghost itself, but what had brought him back, and the fact that for Sylvie anyway, that there was such reassurance and comfort in the sense of not losing someone that you love, that they're always with you in some form or another.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's another aspect of it. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I want to hear your
I was going to
aspect
say
of it.
something else too. I was aware of is in a way that the Julian, call him the ghost if you went, the revenant. I like that word better actually. The return, the one who returns and hovers over the narrative, the events unfolding in front of him. He can't be seen by the people who are whose lives are ongoing after his absence, and and it struck me that this is a wonderful image for the omniscient narrator, for he or she who tells the story, and hovers just outside the story at the window panes, as it were. And as he does, stands by the lamplight down on the quay and looks up and listens to her playing the piano. This is exactly the perspective that the omniscient narrator, or take it a step back even from that, exactly the perspective that the novelist obtains and seeks. It's as this almost as if the novelist, by nature, seeks to be a revenant. Was that in your mind in any way when you were working?
Yes, and the omniscient narrator was very much in my mind, but I wanted a different take on it, that there are limits to his omniscience, because if he knew how the story was going to turn out, he wouldn't need to come back, he wouldn't need to see the quest through. So it's a very human sort of omniscience, in that there are things you don't know. He says that his terrain is not the future, but the past. So he can look back to all the historical moments that have led to this, but he can't look forward to how this is going to be resolved. And that's what happens. But Russell, I know now why all your students just worship you. And I'm sure there's some in the audience today, because you just get to the heart of the matter. And the thing about the storyteller and the narrator is completely, central to the book. There were a couple of people who rejected the book in an earlier form. They said, we love it, but get rid of the ghost. And I went, but that's the interest of the story for me, is the narrator, is how we actually construct and tell stories. So the ghost stayed, and although it took me many years to get published, I was very lucky to find an editor and publisher who absolutely got and loved the ghost. So.
Well, it is a remarkable and beautiful book, and the more I think about it, the more engaged I am. Partly, too, I have to confess, is because of my love of Paris. It is, I think, as someone wrote in one of those quotes on the cover, it is a love story to Paris. That's that. I first went to Paris in 1985. And it was there were two places on this planet I've been to outside my homeland where I felt when I got there, I'd already been there. And I think Paris is one, and the other is the Midlands and upper part of England into Scotland. And I think a lot of that had to do with, before I got there, I had read so much of France's, of Paris's reality, going back to de Maupassant, even Balzac, and coming forward, and Baudelaire, and coming forward into the 20th century all the way up. now into the 21st. But by the time I got there, Paris was an imaginative, profoundly developed construct in my mind. Hemingway's Movable Feast and so forth. These had created a city in my mind, just as certain English writers had created the Midlands, the 19th century, 18th century mainly, English writers had created a certain part of England for me in a way that 19th century English writers hadn't done about London. I never quite got London. When I get there, it still seemed like a foreign city. But when I went north, no, I'm home again. And when I went to Paris, I thought, I'm home again, because I brought with me memories, images, imagination that had mainly been created by literature, and to some degree by films as well. But mainly literature, the subtleties, the nuances, the delicacies of it, and the brutality of it. I mean, I think Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, how important that was to me for understanding Paris. And I feel you had the same kind of experience when you went there. You went there back 20 years ago or so, right? You and Daniel.
Right. Yes. Yes, we did. And I had that same feeling, that I know this place, like you meet somebody and you think, I've never met you before, but I know you. And why should that be? It's so different from Miami. It's so different from Calcutta, where I was born and brought up, Miami, where I live. But, because I'm from India, so you always say, in another life, I must have known it. But I think you're right. I did know it in another life, and it was the life of books through which I knew it, and
films too. I mean, I have the Criterion channel. Now that we're locked up at home, we're watching a lot of movies we missed somewhere along the way, and I'm watching through the Criterion channel a lot of old French movies from the 30s and 40s. And yes, I say that's the Paris that I remember. That's the Paris I know. It's love, yes.
Yeah, and also I think it's so. Paris itself is so cinematic, because it's so beautiful, but also there's this sense of watching and being watched. The first the Lumiere brothers premiered the first moving pictures in Paris, so I think there is that intimate connection. What I was saying about looking up at the window panes, that's kind of the sense you get of the filmmaker watching it.
Well, it's a remarkable city, and more so than any other I know, where you're both surrounded by human beings and distanced from them because of the necessity of a vast and clotted city on the one hand, and yet invited into constant intimacy with these people, these millions, through the life of the streets, cafes, and bars and restaurants, and then the windows that are on the street, and you can look up as you walk down along the quays. You can look up left and see them living their lives there, and wonder and imagine their lives as you do in this book. No, it's a remarkable and great city.
It is, and I will say this: when I started writing about Paris, I felt a great deal of hesitation. I thought, I'm not native to it. I haven't lived there all my life. Am I going to get something wrong? Will someone catch me on the street and say, but Madame, you put this place in this arrondissement, that's completely wrong. But fortunately, that hasn't happened yet. I'm sure it will. But if it was important to me to get that right, how much more of a moral responsibility I had when writing about the Holocaust and writing about these events. That is what was most important to get right. And I've had so many people who are survivors of that time write to me and say, yes, you got it. You got that time. So that was extremely gratifying to me as a writer. Yeah. And if people have questions in the audience, I'll just ask everybody please don't come up with any spoilers because there is a mystery in the book. And if we don't get to your questions now, you can just email me through my website and I'll answer them directly for you later. Okay. So Russell, you want to check the questions and
all right, what do I
them?
do? Do I hit the chat
Yeah,
box?
no, there's next to it, there's ask a question. And
Oh,
I see
okay.
that there
I'll
are
hit
5
that.
questions
Okay.
there. Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
do I read the questions and then you
Yeah. Yeah.
answer them? That's the
Right.
role I like, actually. Ms.
Okay.
Chaudhry, this is from a woman named Mary. Ms. Chaudhry, your beautiful words speak to the true meaning of humanity. I am a middle school English teacher here in Miami. Do you have any advice to help students learn empathy through writing? That's an interesting question.
That's a lovely question. And I will say one thing about being a late blooming author is it gives me a chance to publicly acknowledge all my teachers who have been with me, whether physically or not, through this long journey. I can still remember my 3rd grade English teacher. So I will say to your students that you see other people as human through language. We define our humanity, our empathy through language. When you call people vermin or diseased or the enemy, you have constructed something that is not human. So when you read, when you write, when you use the words that are as one person to another, it's the equivalent of looking someone in the eye. That's when you realize that it doesn't matter where we come from, what our situation, that at bottom we want the same things. We want love, we want family, we want a place in the world. And the other thing I'll tell you to tell them, you can use me as an object lesson, is never, ever give up.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is a tough one too, from Rem to Go, REM to GO. He says, agreed, or she, agreed, we choose often between passion and comfort. But isn't that in itself a luxury? Do economic circumstances, and especially poverty, give us the option to go for passion?
Wow, that's a
Yeah.
good question because yes, it is a luxury, and it is any sort of choice is a luxury. For those of us who can stay home and try and be safe and not infect people, not get infected in this time of COVID-19, that's a luxury that a lot of people who are caught and trapped in poverty do not have. So I think it's also in a very paradoxical way that when you don't have the luxury of choice, you also don't have as much to lose. And then you go for your passion because what is it that you can lose that you haven't already lost? So I think people, just think about the French Revolution. It wasn't fought by the bourgeois, it was by the people in the street who did not have bread to eat. So that's when they went for their passion for change, for a restructuring of society where it would be less unequal.
Well, we also have to think of anger as a passion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe when we were talking about it in terms of the novel, we were talking about marital circumstances and domestic circumstances and opposing a comfortable marriage versus a passionate relationship. But in the circumstances that the questioner raises, passion can also be expressed and chosen as anger over and against acceptance and passive,
Mm-hmm.
or even a kind of a resignation. You could set the same polarity up between anger and resignation as between passion and comfort, and still be talking about the same thing, except in different economic and social circumstances. Okay, here's another question. I see our timer is working here. Okay, how much research did you have to do for your book? Did you learn anything along the way that surprised you? This is from Caroline M.
Okay. Yes, I did a lot of research for this book. I got my PhD from the University of Miami. So I spent a lot of time learning how to research academically and then write academically. And then I spent even more time trying to forget how to research and write academically and to write as a novelist. So what happened was, I wish I were the kind of writer who would go from point A to the end and say, oh, I know where this story is going. I need to look up this, and this. But for me, it's sort of mutually informing. As I'm writing, I'm discovering where the story is going. And then I have to go back and research that period. So, for instance, at that point, I had no idea that I would be writing about laundries in Paris, which are very important to Paris. But then I had to do a whole bunch of research. And one thing that surprised me is the story of Delphine, which when you read it, after that, go back and look up, everybody's a Google detective now, right? Go back and look up L'Inconnue de la Seine, the unknown woman of the Seine. And you will see that many people wrote their own interpretations of her life, but this was mine. And the other thing that was a gift of research was that, I was telling you about the deportation memorial. It was built on the site of the old Paris morgue. Now, you cannot get more symbolic and, just have it drop in your lap like a treasure. So there were things like that I found out. And there was much I learned about Paris in researching.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question that hasn't been asked yet, but is related to that. Did you learn anything along the way about yourself that surprised you?
Wow. Yes, I think I did. I think I realized that what I had been told about writing time and again was write what you know. And I had written about India and I had written about Miami. And I have a pile of rejections to show for that writing. That was what I knew. So I said, oh, the heck with this. I'm going to write something, completely different, as Monty Python would put it. And so I wrote this book. And then I realized that even though it was set in a different city, which was not my city, it was not my history, it was absolutely something I know. It was love and loss and yearning. So I think that's something that's important also for the middle school teacher, that students need to realize that you can be a writer without borders. And that's something Russell can speak to, since he has done so much with writing and writers around the world.
Okay, here's another question from Ruth Greenfield.
Oh, good grief. Ruth.
At the end of his life, did Julian consider himself a coward, a hero, or something in between?
Ruth, don't do this to me. I mean, she's 96 and still sharper than anybody else when it comes to asking a question. I don't think he thought of himself as a coward. He thought of Sylvie as very brave. But, it plays into this trope that people have, oh, the Jews were so passive when they were being rounded up. Well, that's something I learned, that is absolutely not true, that there was the Armée Juive, and a lot of the people in the Resistance were Jews. So I don't think that he thought he was either a hero or a coward, but he felt a lot of survivor guilt because he was away when the roundups took place, and his sister was rounded up while he was safely away.
All right, here's a question from Andrew Tertes Kedem. Yes, I love the music and depth of the book. Did you have to fight any urges to have Julian make contact and affect Sylvie directly, not only through her internal process?
Hello, Andrew. Andrew Russell is one of the students at the New York State Summer Writers Institute, so you would know him too. And he is now in Portland. Thank you for saying that about music. Unlike Ruth, I'm not a musician, but my instrument is language. So I have to work with rhythm and cadence and tone to get the music out of there. And I'm sure that Julien just felt absolutely bereft that he could not reach out to Sylvie. But I had to set the parameter of the other world that I was dealing with, and that was the only person who can see a ghost is one who is going to join their ranks. So obviously he has this desire to be with her, but also this fear that if she's aware he's there, then it's not good for
her. Here's a good question. I'm interested in this one too. Dia Frid asks, did you find yourself playing the music you spoke of, not yourself necessarily, but recordings as you wrote? Because your sentence construction, your poetic turn of phrase, the romance of the language you used certainly seems like music to me. Really beautifully composed, your book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, dear. It's, many people, and I don't know, I want to ask you this, Russell, if it's true for you, many people listen to a soundtrack when they write. They actually have a playlist made up. I don't. I need complete silence to write so that I can hear the voices in my head more clearly. And it's funny, I don't see people as clearly, my characters as clearly as I hear them. And each one, and I hope you'll find it in the book, has a distinct voice. You would never mistake Ana Carvalho, the Portuguese concierge, for another character in the book, or Coco for that matter. But then at the end, it turns out, and if you go to my website, you'll find out that there is a soundtrack to the book. All the music that I have in the book is there, the Chopin Barcarolle, which is throughout. There's Schubert. There's also street music from Paris. So I wasn't listening to it through recordings, but I was hearing it in my memory when I wrote.
Yeah, I listen to music, and I think, like you, I construct a kind of a soundtrack, but I don't listen to, I need silence when I work, when I write. But I go back and listen to music. I also go back and I read poetry. I read other works of fiction, constantly looking for both reinforcement and challenge and comfort and inspiration all at once. And music is one of the places I go to, and it's often period music, or it's associated with the world that I'm trying to write about. And it's a way of entering into that world a little more imaginatively. I might say there's one other thing I've been doing this last year, working on a novel. It's historical and is set back in the late 19th, early 20th century, is that I'm collecting antique postcards from that era, which help me to visualize the place and the time that I'm writing about. And music operates when you're working just like that. I mean, it helps you hear and understand and catch the rhythm of the place that you're writing about. All right, here's another question. And I think we're going to run through this here. This one says, it's from Lola. Oh, Lola. Hello, Lola. Lola is a friend back from
Yeah.
the Saratoga Springs conferences. She says, how did the characters come to you? Was it an organic process where they appeared fully realized as you were writing the novel? Or did you have to construct them with little knowledge of who they were and what parts they would play in the novel? That's a typical Lola question.
It
Good for you.
is.
Good for you,
And
Lola.
and I know Lola is here for Russell Banks, whom she adores, and she's a friend also. We were writers together in the writing master class, and we've stayed in touch. So that's one way that books and writing connect people. I think that for me, the most important thing is the voice. If I feel I have a voice, I will follow it wherever it takes me. And, Julien was just fully formed, but that didn't mean that I knew all the ways in which he would fit into the story. And with Sylvie, that's the same thing. I knew her essential outlines, but they don't spring, like Minerva from the head of Zeus, fully formed. You learn about them as you are writing them. You flesh them out. One action has consequences for the rest of the book, and it changes their character as you're writing them. So, again, I'm not the most efficient of writers, but I think it's what Robert Frost says, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And I was constantly surprised by my characters about what they wanted to do. Even the judge, whom Russell likes, who was also a big judge of wine, like Russell, he surprised me with some of the things that he turned out to have in his characters. So yeah, Lola, I see the characters, I know them, but I find out more about them as I go. As with people you love, you don't know everything about them at first sight. It takes time, and it takes their actions to reveal.
Yeah,
So
it's
do we
also
have time for one? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
it's
Go
also
ahead.
true for the people you don't love. What you said,
Yeah.
we have to learn to not not judge, not conclude. I mean, isn't that the essence of being a writer? Is of fiction, is the refusal to idealize and the refusal to judge, and that's what leads you to, as you say, go beyond those first impressions of your character when they show up only as a piece of the plot, or they show up only because you need a brother or you need a husband or a wife or whatever for your story and your character. But by refusing to idealize or judge them, then you're led to their humanity. And by being led to the humanity, you're taking the novel directly into the humanity of the world that you're trying to create. And ultimately, what else does a novel do but humanize the world that we all share?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so beautiful. I don't see if there's anything one can add to that.
Well, we've got down to 58:08. Is that near the end, I think? And we're at the end of our questions, too.
Okay. So good timing. Everybody got the questions in, and thank you, everyone. Listen, buy your books from your local independent booksellers, please.
Yes.
They are always there for us. We need to be there for them. And Books
Yeah,
and
you
Books
and I
is
wouldn't be
hosted
here tonight if it were not for the independent booksellers. Books and Books in particular, but generally, yes.
In particular, that's right. So buy your books from them. They don't all have to be my book, okay? Some can be Russell's. So thank you very much for coming, and stay in touch.
Yeah, good
Thank you,
night, all.
Russell.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night, darling. Bye-bye.
Yeah.